in surveys.
Sorry,
I'm sorry?
I apologize. I just pressed the button.
Okay. So the public responded through online surveys and through a virtual meeting. And of course, we met then on February 16th and we made comments and obviously recommendations. So now the comments and recommendations have been weighed and considered, and they will be presented to us as part of the second draft, which we will hear tonight from Anita Sott, I believe, from WSP will present it. Now, I want you to be aware that this is not the official public meeting, which must happen soon in the process. It will happen soon after notification has been given. So since this is not the mandated public meeting, it's only PAC who will be making comments and asking questions. The public will have their opportunity later. And I just wonder, is that it? Do you think we can go on now?
Madam Chair, I just want to say that there were no specific notice requirements, but the planning department did put a notice in the paper in July, and understanding that there's going to be a second notice with respect to the online open house that's going to take place in the next couple of weeks. So I imagine that Anita will speak a little bit more to that tonight. Thank you.
Very good. And of course, the actual zoning review at the stage it is right now is on the city's website. So by all means, familiarize yourself with it. So I think we're ready for you, Anita. If you'd like to address us, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, members of PAC and city staff. Our project manager, Nadia DeSanti, will be kicking off the presentation, and I will just take this opportunity to share my screen. If Ellie, if you could please confirm that you can view it.
Yep, I can view it.
Okay, great.
Hello, good evening, Madam Chair, members of PAC and city staff. My name is Nadia DeSanti, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to present the second draft zoning bylaw to PAC as part of the city's comprehensive zoning bylaw review. And Anita and I will share the presentation for tonight's meeting. And as Madam Chair indicated, we last presented to PAC in February of 2021 on the first draft zoning bylaw and zoning map. Since then, revisions have been made based on the comments received from the city, PAC, the Technical Advisory Committee, and members of the public. This slide provides an overview of this presentation. We will briefly look at the zoning bylaw review process and then provide an overview of the second draft zoning bylaw, including the general structure and various sections. We'll then discuss key changes made in the second draft zoning bylaw based on comments received on the first draft. And lastly, we will explain how members of the public can continue to share their input and discuss specific upcoming community engagement opportunities, as well as next steps in the process. This slide provides a snapshot of where we are in the comprehensive zoning bylaw review process. To date, we have completed all background work. The first draft zoning bylaw, which was issued in January of this year, and followed by an online public open house on the first draft in February. At this time, the second draft zoning bylaw and zoning map have been prepared and made available on the city's project website as of Friday, August 6th. Tonight's meeting is the third of a total of 4 PAC meetings, and we are presenting the second draft zoning bylaw for PAC's information and to receive any comments. Following this meeting, an online statutory public open house will take place between August 30th and September 10th to receive public feedback on the second draft zoning bylaw and zoning map. Then a final draft zoning bylaw will be prepared and presented at a statutory public meeting this fall, then to council for adoption. The second draft zoning bylaw has been prepared based on comments received and through the online public open house number 3 that we held in February of 2021. Like the first draft, the second draft zoning bylaw document is made up of 5 main sections. The first section is the administration interpretation section, which describes how the zoning bylaw is implemented by the city. It also contains information on how the zoning bylaw provisions and zoning map should be read and interpreted. Section 2 are the definitions, which are provided for permitted uses and also for key terms that are used in the zoning bylaw. And we've included quite a few illustrations to help clarify certain definitions. So we hope that those have been helpful and look forward to any comments on those. Section 3 are the general provisions, which contain provisions that apply to, or that may apply to, all properties in all zones, depending on the proposed development. For example, these include provisions related to accessory buildings as well as parking requirements. Sections 4 to 29 contain the individual zones that make up the city. So in total, there are 26 different zones which are organized by land use types. So for example, residential, commercial, employment, rural, and open space. And then each zone has its own section in the zoning bylaw, which establishes the permitted uses, the zone standards. So those would include things such as minimum lot area, setbacks, maximum building heights. Any additional provisions that might be specific for a specific use in that zone, and then exception zones, which contain provisions that only apply to specific properties. Section 30 of the zoning bylaw introduces the zoning map, which illustrates the proposed zoning for all properties in the city. Zone boundaries are outlined in red on the zoning map, so they're a lot easier to read. The legend lists the zone acronyms that are used on the map. So for example, Res 10 means the residential 10 zone, and GC means the general commercial zone. We encourage, and all property owners are encouraged to review the proposed zoning and to contact the city if there are any concerns. So it is the onus of property owners to check their properties against the zoning map. And if there's any questions, that they should contact city staff. Once the zoning bylaw and zoning map have been finalized and approved by council, at the end of the zoning bylaw review process, the zoning map will be converted to an interactive map on the city's website. So it's going to replace the interactive map that's currently available on Cornwall Maps. But that will only happen once the zoning bylaw has been adopted and there are no further changes. So how are we going to navigate, or how is an individual going to navigate the zoning bylaws? So this slide provides a brief overview for someone to use the document and see what zone and therefore what provisions would apply. So the first step is to find your property on the zoning map and use the map legend to determine what zone your property is in. So for this example, if you're in one of the areas there on, let's say, just north of Emma Avenue, you're in a Res 10. So then you would go to the legend on the zoning map and you'd see, okay, I'm in residential 10 low density. Then you go to the zone section. So you would check where Res 10 is listed within the sections 4 to 29. And you find out what uses are permitted and what development standards are required. So if you wanted to build a garage or you wanted to build an extension, you would be able to find out what are your setbacks from the property lines, what do you need to do for a garage, and that will pull you back to section 3 of the zoning bylaw, which are the zone provisions. So let's say you get into your Res 10 zone and you see a use that's listed. So then you go to section 2, which is the definitions, and that will provide the precise meaning of a use or a zoning term such as exterior side yard. And so you can go there to understand, what does that term mean? How do I figure that out? And as I mentioned, we've tried to embed as many illustrations as we think are necessary to help illustrate a definition or a term or a concept. So happy to receive comments on that. And step 4 is really to check section 3. Those are the general provisions that may apply to multiple zones. They could apply to a use. It could apply, well, definitely on the number of parking spaces. And so, you know, accessory structures, like I mentioned, perhaps a detached garage or a shed. If you're thinking of putting that on your property, you really need to check section 3 to make sure that you can put it there and the physical placement of it on your property. So I'm going to turn it over to Anita, and she was going to get into a lot more technicalities of other changes that have been made in the second draft.
Okay, thank you, Nadia. So the next few slides describe key changes that have been made in the second draft zoning bylaw based on comments received as Nadia described. However, for all changes made, we do encourage that PAC members and the public review the full second draft zoning bylaw document and zoning map. For ease of review and comparison with the first draft that was published in January, we have shown revisions in the document in 2 ways. Additions made since that first draft are highlighted in blue, and any text that has been deleted is shown in red with a strike through, as shown in this excerpt on the slide. So the format in which the individual zones are presented is the same as it was in the first draft zoning bylaw. As the city's current zoning bylaw dates back to 1969, there have been many amendments made over the years, and this has resulted in the need for some simplified organization of the document and the way zoning provisions are laid out. So in this image on the slide, we are going to just remind PAC and the public of some of the features of the new document and how it's formatted. So as shown in number 1 in the top right corner of the document page, the sections of the zoning bylaw are color-coded and they alternate with blue and green headers to identify the section title or the zone you're in, for example. And each zone also includes a zone icon. As shown in number 2, each zone section begins with what's referred to as a preamble, and that is a series of text that explains the intent of the zone and its relationship to the city's official plan land use designations, and also what types of development are generally permitted in that zone. In number 3, permitted uses, so uses that are permitted within that zone, have been organized in a bulleted list, and they are presented in alphabetical order in each zone. The terms used to describe permitted uses have been modernized and in some cases grouped, and every permitted use has a definition. And as shown in number 4 on the slide, zone standards for development have been reorganized in tables, and metric measurements have been used consistently throughout the bylaw. Site-specific exceptions, which Nadia mentioned, only apply to specific properties, and these have been added to the second draft zoning bylaw under a section at the end of each zone. So each site-specific exception is also numbered on the zoning map with a zone acronym and a dash, as well as an assigned number. So in this red box, you see that this exception applies to a property that is in the residential 10 zone, and the -3 represents the site-specific exception number. So if anyone sees that their property has a dash and a number on the zoning map, they should go to that zone, to the exceptions section, to consult it and see that there are site-specific exception provisions. Some existing exceptions which are in the city's current zoning bylaw have been deleted. For example, if they are historic or outdated, or if that property has been fully built out according to the exception provisions. That said, we do encourage that all property owners with site-specific exceptions in the city's current zoning bylaw should carefully review the exception zones. And as always, if there are any concerns, we ask that you please contact city staff. Site-specific exceptions which have a holding zone are identified with an H in brackets, as shown in red on the slide. A holding zone means that there are certain holding provisions which must be satisfied, and the bylaw must be amended to remove that holding zone prior to any development taking place. So in other words, they are can be thought of as a development condition. Section 1.12.4 of the second draft zoning bylaw also provides some general information and provisions on holding zones in general. Section 2 definitions of the zoning bylaw has been revised to add a few new definitions which correspond to a few new permitted uses that have been added or new general provisions, or to clarify some definitions that were included in the first draft. For example, we've added a new definition for angular planes, as there are new general provisions associated with the concept of angular planes as it applies to maximum building heights in some zones. I'll explain these angular plane provisions a bit further in the presentation. As I mentioned, every permitted use that is listed under a zone has a corresponding definition. Similar permitted uses have been grouped under a single term in some cases. So for example, different types of stores and shops that are listed as permitted in the current zoning bylaw are now simply grouped and referred to as retail stores. Some definitions also have illustrations, as Nadia mentioned, to assist in understanding and interpreting their meaning. For example, the definitions include explanations and illustrations of different dwelling types, such as a duplex dwelling, as shown on this slide. Based on comments received from the Raisin Region Conservation Authority, who is a member of the Technical Advisory Committee for the project, new general provisions have been added in section 3.1.1 to guide the development of boathouses as an accessory use on waterfront properties. So these provisions would apply to any new proposed boathouse. And the proposed provisions prohibit human habitation in a boathouse and regulate the maximum number of boathouses on a lot, the location of a boathouse in proximity to an adjacent lot, as well as maximum height, length, and gross ground floor area. I mentioned the concept of angular planes being reintroduced. So this was based on discussions with city planning staff, and the application of angular planes, we'd like to note, are currently required in some zones in the city's existing zoning bylaw. So an angular plane is a conceptual line that projects across a lot at an angle that's typically measured horizontally from a lot line. The concept is used to regulate maximum building height for taller buildings and is sometimes found in zoning and often found in urban design guidelines in some municipalities. So several zones have been revised to permit 30-meter maximum building heights subject to angular planes. So for an example, angular planes would apply to an apartment dwelling in a residential 40 zone or to an office building in the mixed-use commercial zone. Where zone standards prescribe maximum building heights subject to angular planes, the building must be located within that required angular plane, and it can be set back, stepped back at various stories, or terraced to fit in this conceptual area. So as shown on the image on the left, in the case of a lot line that abuts a street, the angular plane would be measured at a 60-degree angle from the center line of the abutting street, and that building must be located within that angular plane line. As shown on the right, in the case of a lot line which abuts a lot that's occupied by a residential building that is 13.5 meters in height or less, or what's generally considered a low-rise building, that angular plane would be measured at a 60-degree angle from the lot line abutting the adjacent residential building. So the real purpose to these provisions is to ensure that adequate transition is provided between taller buildings where they are permitted in a zone and the street or an adjacent low-rise residential use. Again, based on discussion with city staff, we have included a new series of general provisions in section 3.28 to guide the development of small-scale urban horticulture uses. Now, this use involves the use of land on a limited scale, either for the indoor or outdoor cultivation and harvesting of fruits, vegetables, edible plants, honey, and mushrooms, and specifically for commercial sale, so not just for personal consumption. The use is proposed to be permitted in the highway commercial zone and in all employment zones, and would be limited to lots with a maximum lot area of 0.8 hectares. So these are not intended to be large indoor agricultural production operations. They would also permit limited on-site retail sales of products that are manufactured or made on-site. Several general provisions regarding parking requirements have also been revised in consultation with city staff, and primarily to help clarify provisions for residents and developers based on some feedback we received. So for example, in section 3.20.2, we've updated provisions to clarify how a property owner would calculate the maximum permitted size of a driveway for dwellings that have 1 to 4 dwelling units. So for a single detached home, for example, up to a 4-plex. A maximum of 40% of the entire front yard can be occupied by a driveway. And if there is an attached garage, which projects in front of the main dwelling, as shown in the image here in gray, so this area would represent the attached garage. There is what is called an interior yard next to that garage space. And that area would be included in the calculation with the rest of the front yard, which is this larger red rectangle. And we've added this illustration to hopefully clarify that calculation for users of the bylaw. Continuing with parking, some minimum parking space rates have also been revised for certain uses. So for example, for home occupations, the bylaw has been updated to clarify that 1 parking space is required for a home occupation that serves clients or customers on site. And in addition, if there is a non-resident employee who works at that home occupation, a separate dedicated parking space would be required for that employee. But these 2 parking spaces could be provided as tandem parking or back-to-back on a driveway, for example. The parking space for restaurants has also been revised to address some instances in the city where there has been an overabundance of required surface parking for restaurant uses. And a new parking space rate has been introduced for small-scale urban horticulture to accompany those new provisions as well. Barrier-free or accessible parking space requirements have also been revised to better align with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act to differentiate between Type A, or those spaces that are van accessible, and Type B parking spaces, which are narrower but still require a 1.5 meter access aisle. The provisions now provide direction on how many spaces of each type, whether Type A or Type B, are required, and this would depend on the total number of barrier-free spaces that are required on a lot. So the previous illustration that was accompanying the provisions has also been updated to show the dimension differences of a Type A and a Type B parking space. Now moving on to key changes under the individual zones. The second draft zoning bylaw continues to contain 26 zones, as did the first draft. However, we have changed some zone acronyms. The proposed employment zones have also been revised to 3 zones, which are now called Employment Area Light, Employment Area General, and Employment Area Heavy. The previously proposed Employment Area Service has been combined with the Employment Area Light zone, as the permitted uses were essentially identical. and a new heavy zone has been introduced. So currently in the second draft zoning map, there are no properties that have been assigned the employment area heavy zone, but we did want to note that city staff are currently in the process of reviewing which properties may be zoned heavy in line with their current operations and the nature of the use on site. In some zones, permitted uses have also been revised based on discussions with city staff and some comments we received from PAC and members of the public. For example, a hospice has been added as a permitted use wherever a hospital is permitted in a zone, and we've updated all residential zones to permit daycare centers. In the residential zones in particular, certain lot standards have been revised for consistency and based on feedback from the development community. So zone standards for maximum lot occupancy, or how much of a lot a building can occupy, as well as landscaping requirements, are now consistent across all zones where triplexes, quadruplexes, and apartment dwellings are permitted. Minimum rear yard setbacks for residential uses, including row houses, triplexes, quadruplexes, and apartment dwellings have been decreased to 8 meters across all zones. Minimum interior side yard setbacks for single detached, semi-detached, and duplex dwellings have also been clarified to explain the different setbacks that apply depending on whether the dwelling has a carport, a detached garage, or an attached garage with or without living space above or behind that garage. We've also added an illustration to demonstrate the different side yard setbacks which might apply depending on the scenario. So as in the first draft zoning bylaw, each zone has also been updated with a maximum building height standard for all permitted uses in that zone. A detailed review of the proposed maximum building heights in the first draft zoning bylaw was undertaken in collaboration with city staff and with consideration that of the comments that we previously received from PAC and from the public. Some zones now permit 30-meter maximum building heights for specific uses, and these would be subject to the angular plane section of the bylaw, which I described earlier. So 30-meter maximum building heights have been proposed specifically for apartment dwellings in the residential 40, central business district, Le Village district, and mixed-use commercial zones. And for non-residential uses in the central business district, Le Village, and mixed-use commercial zones. And lastly, for combined residential and non-residential uses in the mixed-use commercial zone. The last key change that we'll discuss deals with the floodplain zone. So in the first draft zoning bylaw, we had several placeholders for the concept of a floodplain overlay as opposed to a floodplain zone. And while that was being previously considered, there have been many ongoing discussions between city staff and the Raisin Region Conservation Authority. And the decision has been that the city's existing environmental constraint floodplain zone in the current bylaw should be maintained, and the boundaries of this zone as shown in the city's current bylaw will stay the same. We would like to note that in the future, the boundaries of this zone may be reviewed by the city upon completing a comprehensive watershed floodplain modeling and mapping study in partnership with the Conservation Authority, which would be undertaken separately from the current zoning bylaw review project and would serve the purpose of developing updated information and modeling to determine the extent of floodplains in the city today. So I'll turn it back over to Nadia to discuss next steps and some upcoming public engagement opportunities.
Thanks, Anita. So we continue to welcome public input throughout the zoning bylaw review process. Comments in English and French can be provided through the dedicated project email. Regular project updates will continue to be provided as the project moves forward and to provide engagement materials and reports as they become available. Future public open houses will be advertised on the project website, on the city's social media accounts, through newspaper notices, and in community bulletins at major facilities. So in terms of next steps, as I mentioned, our online statutory public open house will be available from August 30th to September 10th. We will be issuing our final draft zoning bylaw in October, and it will be prepared and published on the city's website 20 days before the statutory public meeting. We are anticipating that the statutory public meeting will be held in the fall, followed by the final zoning bylaw and council adoption in December. So on behalf of our team, we'd like to thank you, and Mary can continue to answer questions and address comments following tonight's meeting, but we open it up for any questions or comments from the PAC members. Thank you very much.
And thank you. And first question, Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question with regards to this angular plane thing. Does that mean that, like, if you look at the building on the corner of 2nd and Sydney Street, that little, I don't know if it's an apartment building or condo development, 2nd, just kind of cat-a-corner to the public library, it is currently 6 stories. If the builder wanted to go to that 9-story, 10-story provision, does that mean that he couldn't build that building straight up like he has now, that he'd have to try to set that back? And that being said, if he does, if he has a limited amount of square footage to work with, how could he ever accommodate this whole angular plane thing based on the diagram and still like build apartments? I'm a little confused. So I'll make the question as brief as I can. If somebody builds a building in that area, for example, Central Business District, for example, does that mean they have to angle their building back on that 60-degree slope, even though they're already in what is essentially a commercial kind of high residential neighborhood anyway?
So perhaps before we hear from you, Nadia, I think Mary Joyce Smith would like to
And
make a
whoever
comment.
wants to take it on,
Thank
I'm
you.
willing to.
I think it's important to understand that the bylaw currently has angular planes, so it's not new. It's just helping staff to understand it a little bit better. So your building you're speaking about has a illegal non-conforming status because he renovated that building, right? That's a very old building, so.
Oh, no, the one with the church.
Pardon
Corner
me?
of Sydney Street and 2nd.
Okay, so they could have gone for what's called a minor variance to it too, if they're not, if they can't meet the angular planes. They can also petition Committee of Adjustment for a minor variance. But I think all they're trying to do is further explain that if you've got a single remember the school we did up by Marlborough there? And there's going to be another building in the back, but there's a single family home right there. So, I mean, you have to have, we're just trying to ensure respect and integrity for the existing land uses around.
I get somebody building a building in a what is a residential kind of neighborhood. That I get that you can't put a skyscraper beside a
That's
bungalow.
right. And we're trying to
I'm
just
fine with
protect it. Yeah.
But my point is, if somebody is building a building right beside the Seaway building,
Yeah.
do they still have to honor this angular plane
Well, I think
provision?
Nadia would back
Seaway
me up.
building's 10 stories high.
Mhm. If they can't, they can go for a minor variance to Committee of Adjustment. But it's suggested that, you would try to address the requirements. And if you can't, well, we'll review.
Yeah, I kind of have a problem with that provision.
But it's
anyway.
there now, Counselor. I mean, it's in the bylaw now. And
Yeah, but we're revising now, so here's the opportunity, if we have a problem with it, to change it now.
well, our
rather
Can
than
I clarify something if possible? So the angular plane in that case, if you're looking at a lot that's proposing a tall building and it's next to an already tall building that is over 13.5 meters in height, so it's not low rise, you would not have to have an angular plane to the side lot line. It would only be to the street. So that would prevent, buildings that are out of proportion with a human scale, that would cast a lot of shadowing and tunneling effects on the street corridor. So it would be potentially stepped back or terraced from the street center line, but not to the side lot line if it was already beside a building that was over that specific height we've put in the bylaw, so 13.5 meters.
Thank you,
Keep it under-
Anita.
Ponder
And
that.
then Grant, you had a comment or question?
Thank you. Mary, is it not factual that the building that JC just put up on Second Street across from Riverdale Terrace, he wanted to move it back, but that angular plane came into effect of that. Is that not right?
That's correct, Mayor. Yes, it is.
So it's in the bylaw right now. It's
Thank you. And Mr. Symington?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a couple questions relating to changes from the first draft to this draft. One has to do with the definition of carport that was added. It seems to be rather brief, and since there are different requirements for a carport versus a garage, I would suggest that we maybe should stick with the existing definition of carport that we have in our present bylaw, which brings in the 60% perimeter figure to define between carport and garage, because the setbacks are different for both items. That's one. And the other addition went in has to do with the prime agricultural and rural. They have a maximum building height of 13.5 meters. That would probably be okay for the normal buildings, but silos exceed that a great deal. And in a lot of bylaws, they exempt silos in the agricultural zone.
We did bring that up to the consultants, and perhaps I'll let
I can speak
Nadia.
to that. Yeah. So the building height that is in the prime agricultural and rural zones is for main buildings. There is a section in the general provisions entitled permitted projections above the height limit, and it specifically exempts silos and other building features such as a church tower or a church spire, for example, mechanical penthouses on office buildings and apartment buildings as being exempt from the maximum building height. So that would permit that extra building height for those building features.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And
What about
Madam Chair,
the-
sorry, just on the comment about the definition of carport, I think, we can take a look at that and discuss with city staff just to see what we can do with that. So I think we can take that one away for another look.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions or comments? Okay, Councillor Bennett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a minor one about the barrier-free parking requirements. It shows that we need to have a 1.5 meter access aisle between spaces. I'm not aware of any business in town that has that now. So would this be something that business would be required to change, or is this going forward?
My understanding is it's with respect to the recent Accessibility Act that's come forth. Perhaps Nadia, do you want to add to that as well? Or it would be new
Yes, thanks.
construction.
So, through you, Madam Chair, that's right. It's for any new developments, or let's say there's a redevelopment of a property, an expansion, the new provision for the barrier-free space with the aisle width would kick in then, but it doesn't mean that everyone has to go and change their parking lots at the moment. So it would be for moving forward.
Thank you. And well, I have a question touching on rental units. A home can have a rental unit in a residential area. I'm assuming that it's qualified as residential. So what if somebody wanted to convert their rental unit to Airbnb? Would that, at some point, does it become a commercial enterprise as opposed to a residential? I'm thinking because I've heard of some renters who have been moved out of the homes in which they were living because the owners wanted to convert to Airbnb. And I know in the city of Cornwall, we're watching very closely our rental units and trying to increase them as much as possible. So I just wonder if there's a line crossed when you go from a rental apartment to an Airbnb.
Mary, would you like us to address or would you like to speak?
Address that, yes.
Sure. So through you, Madam Chair, the zoning bylaw does not specifically address what's generally referred to as short-term accommodations or short-term rentals like Airbnb. Many municipalities are electing to regulate that change or the introduction of an Airbnb, whether it's a room or the entire house, through other means like a licensing bylaw, which would require property owners to apply for a license or a permit to rent out their spaces. And through that mechanism, some municipalities are bringing in other provisions such as a maximum number of people that can rent that space, a maximum duration for that space. It is a topic that we explored through our zoning strategy report and some previous public engagement opportunities. And it was decided that the zoning bylaw is not the best tool to regulate it at this time, but the city has some background research through some of our background reports for consideration in the future if it is a problem that council would like to address through something like a licensing bylaw in the future.
Well, thank you for that. It seems it's something we should be ready for, certainly. But you're on it, are you?
Yeah.
In planning? Okay, very good. Now, do tiny homes come up anywhere in this discussion or just indirectly through the parking notes and that sort of thing?
So through you, Madam Chair, tiny homes are effectively permitted in the current zoning bylaw that the city has because there are no minimum dwelling unit size requirements. These do appear in some other municipalities, but not in Cornwall's current bylaw, and we have not introduced those types of provisions. So the zoning bylaw doesn't explicitly speak to tiny homes, but there are no prohibitions on tiny homes through any of the provisions that we've revised or introduced.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you very much for your presentation. And I believe
There would be an action required. So that PAC endorsed the second draft of the zoning bylaw document and zoning map prepared as part of the city's comprehensive zoning bylaw review and recommend same to council. So we need a
mover and a seconder. Amanda, Ms. Brizo, moved, seconded by Councillor Hebert. All in favor? Thank you. And Councillor Hollingsworth? Oh, you're just late voting, eh? Oh, sorry. Moving on to, we have no other business. Information. Obviously, this material is on the city website under zoning review. And
there will possibly be a PAC in September, but I will keep you informed.
right on September 20th,
Yes.
or at the call of the chair.
Mhm.
And that's it. So I'd ask for a motion to adjourn, please. Councillor Bear, Councillor Grant, or Mr. Mayor, all in favor? Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, consultants.
Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Take
everyone.
care.
Bye-bye.